Let's head to China now, where the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet is currently addressing the media after her 6-day tour to China.
I appreciate the government's efforts in making this visit happen, particularly the arrangement for my virtual meeting with President Xi Jinping. I was also able to meet with State Councillor Wang Yi, the Chief Justice of the Supreme People's Court, and with senior officials on public security, justice, ethnic affairs, and human resources, the State Procuratorate, and the Governor of Guangdong Province. I also met with the All China Women's Federation, and during my 2 days in Kashgar and Urumqi, I met with a range of officials, including the Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the Governor and the Vice Governor in charge of public security, among others. I visited Kashgar Prison and the Kashgar Experimental School, a former vocational training and education center, among other places. In addition, I was able to interact with civil society organizations, academics, and community and religious leaders, and others inside and outside the country. In advance of my visit, my office and I met virtually with a number of civil society organizations that are working on issues related to Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and other parts of China. My visit has also been informed by the work of the UN Human Rights Mechanisms on China over many years, and the preparatory work done by my office and my advanced team that arrived in China on the 25th of April. I should state from the outset what this visit was and what it wasn't. This visit was not an investigation. Official visits by a High Commissioner are by their nature high profile and simply not conducive to the kind of detailed, methodical, discrete work of an investigative nature. The visit was an opportunity to hold direct discussions with China's most senior leaders on human rights, to listen to each other, raise concerns, explore, and pave the way for more regular, meaningful interactions in the future, with a view to supporting China in fulfilling its obligation under international human rights law. Considering China's significant role in multilateralism, the visit was an opportunity for me to also discuss several other regional and global issues where China can use its leverage to bring political solutions. To those who have sent me appeals asking me to raise issues or cases with the authorities, I have heard you. Your advocacy matters, and my visit was an opportunity to raise a number of specific situations and issues of concern with the government. I will continue to follow up on such issues and instances of concern on a sustained basis. It would be presumptuous of me to try to encapsulate the full complexity of this vast country's human rights situations in one statement, but allow me to highlight the key topics we were able to discuss at length. Poverty alleviation and the eradication of extreme poverty, 10 years ahead of its target date, are tremendous achievements of China. The introduction of universal health care and almost universal unemployment insurance scheme go a long way in ensuring protection of the rights to health and broader social and economic rights. China's efforts in support of the multilateral 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, both at home and internationally, are also valued. We stress the importance of advancing gender parity and appropriate geographical distribution. Over the years, there has been important legislative and judicial reforms. On gender equality, I welcome revision of the law on protecting women's rights and interests, which should bring about several improvements for protection of women's rights. I also commend the recent reform of the Civil Code that introduced provisions on sexual harassment, as well as the anti-domestic violence law that provides for restraining orders to protect women and children at risk. Of course, as in every country, implementation is key. So it will be important for the authorities to be vigilant in that regard and respond to concerns about how the law is applied in practice. I would like to see more women at all levels of political representation and have encouraged businesses to create the conditions for more women at the top as well. I welcome China's stated aim of ensuring quality development closely linked to strengthening the rule of law and respect for human rights. This is formulated in the Human Rights Action Plan of China and other policy documents. My team had in-depth discussions on how national legislations and practices must reflect international human rights laws and standards, particularly in relation to law enforcement and judicial procedures, and we look forward to continuing to share our expertise with the government and the judiciary. The commitment in the Human Rights Action Plan of China to enforce more rigorous procedures for reviewing capital sentences and implement a more stringent mechanism for reporting and reviewing death penalty cases is also welcome. It is important to issue data on the death penalty, and I do hope China will join the growing international momentum towards abolition of the death penalty. In my discussions with senior officials, the themes of development, peace, and security arose in every meeting. Of course, for development, peace, and security to be sustainable, it needs to be inclusive and rooted in protection of human rights. I share the concerns of a number of UN human rights mechanisms about laws and policies to counter terrorism and radicalism and their application. Violent acts of extremism have a terrible, serious impact on the lives of victims, including those tasked to protect their community. But it is critical that counter-terrorism responses do not result in human rights violations. The application of relevant laws and policies and any mandatory measures imposed on individuals need to be subject to independent judicial oversight with greater transparency of judicial proceedings, and all victims must be able to seek redress. In the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Regions, I have raised questions and concerns about the application of counter-terrorism and de-radicalization measures under broad application, particularly their impact on the right of Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities. While I'm unable to assess the full scale of the VETCs, I raised with the government the lack of independent judicial oversight of the operation of the program, the reliance by law enforcement officials on 15 indicators to determine tendencies towards violent extremism, allegations of the use of force and ill treatment in institutions, and reports of unduly severe restrictions on legitimate religious practices. During my visit, the government assured me that VETC system has been dismantled. I encourage the government to undertake a review of all counterterrorism and de-radicalization policies to ensure they fully comply with international human rights standards, and in particular that they are not applied in an arbitrary and discriminatory way. Before coming to China, I heard from some Uyghur families now living abroad who have lost contact with their loved ones. In my discussion with the authorities, I appealed to them to take measures to provide information to families as a matter of priority. I also share the concerns of UN human rights mechanisms about legitimate activities by lawyers, human rights defenders, and others being penalized under the national security framework. UN human rights bodies have found the system of residential surveillance constitute arbitrary detention and have called for its repeal. My interactions with NGOs in China were also enriching. There is important work being done to advance gender equality, the rights of LGBTI people, of people with disabilities, and older people, among others. China has a tradition of grassroots engagement, and I cannot overstate how important this is. Broadening the space for meaningful participation and advocacy by civil society is crucial to strengthen participation and the freedom of expression. On the Tibet Autonomous Region, it is important that linguistic, religious, and cultural identity of Tibetans be protected, and the Tibetan people are allowed to participate fully and freely in these decisions about their religious life and for dialogue to take place. I discussed education policies in the Tibet Autonomous Region and stressed the importance of children learning in their own language and culture in the setting of their families or communities. The Hong Kong Special Administrative Region has long been respected as a center for human rights and independent media in the region. It is important that the government there do all it can to nurture, not stifle, the tremendous potential for civil society and academics in Hong Kong to contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights in the HKSAR and beyond. The arrest of lawyers, activists, journalists, and others under the national security law are deeply worrying. Hong Kong is due to be reviewed by the UN Human Rights Committee in July as a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I have called on China to also ratify the covenant, which it signed in 1998. China's recent ratification of the two International Labor Organization conventions, Labor Convention 29 and 105 on forced labor, once deposited, will be a welcome and an important starting point for protecting fundamental principles and rights at work. Beyond ratification, it will now be important to build a broad-based system encompassing not only on labor inspection and enforcement, but prevention and due diligence. Civil society actors, including business, trade unions, NGOs, and the media, also have an important role to monitor compliance and highlight gaps. I encourage China to engage constructively with ILO. I was also able to engage with a representative of China's business community, and I'm encouraged to see Chinese companies and sectors embracing human rights standards for their operation and supply chain. Given the many intersecting global crises facing the world today, including climate change, threats to peace and security, and instability in the global economic system, as well as the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, China has a very important role to play as a key contributor in multilateral and regional fora. We agreed to establish regular engagement between the UN Human Rights Office and the government of China, including through an annual senior strategic meeting for discussions of issues of respective interest at national, regional, or global levels. We also agreed to establish a working group to facilitate substantive exchanges and cooperation between my office and the government through meetings in Beijing and Geneva, as well as virtual meetings. This working group will organize a series of follow-up discussions about specific thematic areas, included but not limited to development, poverty alleviation and human rights, rights of minorities, business and human rights, counter-terrorism and human rights, digital space and human rights, judicial and legal protection and human rights, as well as other issues raised by either side. This will allow for structured engagement by my office with China on a number of human rights issues. And this is especially important that my office does not have a country presence. The working group will also provide a space for us to bring to attention of the government a number of specific matters of concern. The government has also stated that it will invite senior officials from the office to visit China in the future. I spoke to everyone I met in China, regional and national officials, civil society, academics, diplomats, and others with candor, with a sincere desire to make progress on the promotion and protection of human rights for all. I hope we can build on this open and frank approach to carry forward these exchanges in a meaningful and impactful way. I thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for your statement. We will now go to questions, which we will take two at a time. And I would ask, if you are interested in asking a question, that you please raise your hand. I will now ask my colleague to say this in Chinese.
谢谢召集专员。现在是发问的时间，如果你有兴趣发问的话，请你举手。
Thank you. If I may take as the first question from CCTV. Colleague, could you please interpret in Chinese? CCTV.
首先是央视的朋友，请你消除静音，打开你的麦克风。
Please go ahead, CCTV, and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Welcome to China.
请你解释。
Please go ahead, CCTV.
OK. 请允许我用中文提问。可以听到吗 ？Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah. Okay. Could you please allow me to raise question in Chinese? Thank you. 5月24号，我们看到美国德州小学又发生了严重的枪击案，造成了19名的儿童死亡，这非常让人痛惜。联想到美国长期存在的严重的种族主义、种族歧视，以及在海外设立黑监狱，针对难移民的强迫劳动，以及滥施单边制裁、侵犯他国人权等问题，请问高专对此有何评论？您是否准备对美国在国内外都存在的严重的侵犯人权问题来进行调查？谢谢。
Thank you. Interpreter, could you please interpret for the High Commissioner? High Commissioner, are you getting the interpretation? Unmute the High Commissioner, please.
I have not received the interpretation yet.
Okay, if we maybe can move to the next question while the interpretation is prepared. Can I please call on, I think Reuters, Tony Munro. Tony, please unmute yourself. Tony, are you able to unmute yourself?
United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet has concluded her 6-day tour of China. She acknowledged that she met the Chinese President Xi Jinping, civil society organizations, governor of the Xinjiang province. She held discussions with leaders in regards to human rights. Issues of concern were also raised to the Chinese authorities. Among the big takeaways from her visit were discussions on poverty alleviation in China, universal health care, multilateral 2030 agenda. Bachelet commended the gender equality and protection of women's rights in China. Issues of equality development was also key. Death penalty policies and cases was brought up in her meetings. Counter-terrorism and extremism was also part of the agenda. Bachelet says she raised concerns about minorities, including the Uyghurs, where she urged the Chinese authority to provide information to Uyghur families abroad as a matter of urgency. Arrest of journalists is worrying, or was part of the discussion, the arrest of journalists in Hong Kong. She says she raised this with the Chinese authorities. Michelle Bachelet's trip is the first to China by a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2005, and rights groups had warned that it could threaten to whitewash abuses by the ruling Communist Party in Xinjiang, of which she has addressed. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.